Hello, I'm Gina with the Penobscot Marine Museum in Searsport, Maine. Thank you for joining me. I welcome questions, and those can be typed into the comments section. Today, we are going to talk about how people in the mid-1900s remembered the heyday of shipbuilding through art and writing. We'll start by looking at the painting, explore a little more about the history of Searsport, then return to the mid-1900s when this painting was created. What do you see in this painting? What do you think is happening? There are several different mini scenes occurring on a rich backdrop of homes, trees, and hills. Starting in the foreground, I see large stacks of what appear to be logs or lumber. Zooming in, we can see some details. There's a man here adding to the pile of lumber and providing a sense of scale. If the man is around 6 feet tall, the stacks must be 4 to 6 feet tall or even higher. That's a lot of lumber. There are 2 oxen hitched up to a wagon that carried the logs down to the water, and another man is seen next to the wagon. These 2 men are dressed for work in boots and pants, hats, and white shirts with no coat. Their clothing suggests they might be farmers or laborers. On the other hand, this man is talking to another guy, and he is dressed in a top hat, white shirt with a cravat or tie, long coat, dark pants, and dark boots. This is more formal business wear, and this man is likely a businessman, or at least is in town, is not in town to do manual labor. Also in the foreground of this painting, we see 2 kids climbing on the log piles, and we see 2 dogs. I love the details on the black and white dog here. Are the kids and dogs with the farmers? Or are they children from town who wandered down to the waterfront to play? What do you think? Behind the logs, we see an inlet with some docks. There's a man on this dock right here, and he's either tying off a small boat or maybe untying one. There's also a variety of small boats. Heading out toward the bay, we see a man rowing a boat. And over here, we see a small schooner and another rowboat with 2 people in it this time. And then there's a larger schooner and 2 buildings. And further out at bay, we see another schooner, and this one might be a little bit more recognizable because all of the sails are unfurled. Near the schooner is a bunch of poles sticking out of the water. Do you know what that is? We'll return to it later. In the further distance, we see beautiful green hills and more hills beyond. Some clouds hide the blue sky, but it's still a lovely day. Coming back to shore, there is a large vessel, and if we zoom in, we can see it's the John Carver. Then there's an additional building and another building with a smokestack or chimney. And there are several people that are walking around near the John Carver. And behind the John Carver, we can see some houses, some homes, and lots of green trees and grass. There's a lot going on in this painting. It's cool to be able to zoom in and really look at things. The painting tells the story of a small but busy waterfront in town with a shipbuilding industry. Lots of people coming and going, and some logging and farming. This painting is titled Carver Yard with the John Carver on the Ways. It's an oil on canvas completed by Waldo Peirce in 1960. Now let's consider what we know about the history of Searsport and how this painting illustrates it. first, let's locate Searsport on a map. We talk about Searsport a lot, and so hopefully this will help show you where it is. So here you see Maine, and over on the left, you can see Vermont and New Hampshire in the little northeastern corner of New York. And there's Portland and Bangor. And now we're going to zoom in a little bit. Over here is Bar Harbor, and this is where Acadia National Park is. And we're zooming in on Searsport. It is the town that's in the outlined in red. And Google's nice enough to point out the Penobscot Marine Museum, and that's the Sears Island over there on the right. And we're zooming in more, and you can see Searsport Harbor. And this is Route 1 that runs through Searsport, and it's the main street in Searsport. And the public pier, or the dock, is down there. And now you have a general understanding of how Searsport is laid out. And if you want to come visit, the Penobscot Marine Museum is right off Route 1. In 1850, Searsport had a population of 2,208 people. So in 1842, the population was likely about 600 fewer people than today live in what is now Searsport. The bark John Carver gives us a hint about when this scene took place. The bark John Carver was built in 1842 at the Carver Yard. It was the 19th vessel launched from the Carver Yard. And I keep saying it's a bark, and a bark would be a vessel that has 3 masts, and the first 2 masts are square rigged, and the last is fore and aft rigged. And in the painting, the horizontal pieces or yards are not installed yet, so it could be hard to determine the kind of vessel that was being built. 2 years before the bark John Carver, the Carver Yard was among the first on Penobscot Bay to launch a ship. Even though now we call most large things that float a ship, in the 19th century, a ship described a vessel with 3 masts, all square rigged, as we can see in this diagram. 1, 2, 3, and they're all square sails. We also see 3 schooners in this painting, and a schooner has 2 or more masts that are all fore and aft rigged, as we see in this diagram. 2 masts, fore and aft rigged. And so can you find all 3 in this painting? We kind of walked through it earlier, but we have 1, 2, 3. Okay. Let's circle back to these wooden poles. If you guessed that they were part of a fishing weir, you're right. And I have a photo of a fishing weir here. It's this in the front. And this photo is part of the Carol Thayer Berry collection in the Penobscot Marine Museum photo archives. This weir was located on Penobscot Bay, a few towns away in Rockport. And this photo was taken in 1955, over 100 years after the scene in our painting, but it's an excellent visual of a fishing weir. I'm not sure if there was a fishing weir in this location in 1842, but here's an aerial photograph of Searsport in the 1950s, when there was a very large herring fish weir. Fish swam along the shore, ran into the leader, then swam around in circles inside the pound. The fishermen often caught the fish using a seine net inside the weir. Similar weirs were found in towns like Rockport and on the islands in the Muscle Ridge group, and these weirs supplied canneries in Belfast and Rockland. The database description for this painting says that this building, the red building here, is the shipyard steam shed with its chimney. The wood was steamed so it could be bent into ribs and other timbers for the ship. The stacks of wood we see over here are described as barrel staves from the cooper shop, which could be assembled on board ship for cargo carrying. And so here's a photograph from the early 1900s. So this is again about 60 years after the bark John Carver was built. And this photograph shows, this is part of the Penobscot Marine Museum's Eastern collection. And it shows the cooperage in Mechanics Hollow in Searsport near the Carver Yard. Several workers stand on the loading dock extending along the clapboard building, and neat piles of lumber and barrel staves stand in the right foreground. And they do look like the piles in the painting. Now that we've talked about the content of Waldo Peirce's painting, let's talk more about the time it was created and its creator. To do that, let's first take a look at another painting of the bark John Carver. This is an oil painting of the bark John Carver made by Petrus Cornelius Wyatt in 1846, 4 years after it launched. In the background of the painting, you can see Flushing. This is a neat painting, and we might have to revisit it in another peek into paintings. But when you compare this painting with the other one, you can notice they are very different. This is a port painting, and it looks similar stylistically to the other ship's portraits we have examined in the mid-19th century. Wyatt was likely painting a vessel he had seen. Maybe it was even in front of him. Waldo Pierce's painting is different. Stylistically, it is more similar to the painting Yankee Clipper by Philip von Salza that we explored in an earlier program. Von Salza and Pierce were peers. Waldo Peirce was born in 1884 in Bangor, Maine. He studied and painted in the US and abroad before settling down in Searsport in the mid-1900s. Like von Salza, Peirce also joined the Works Progress Administration in the 1930s. More examples of his work can be found in our collection, as well as such prominent museums as the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the Brooklyn Museum, and also locally. Pierce's portrait of Ernest Hemingway graced the cover of Time magazine in 1937. When Pierce painted this work, he was painting a vessel he had never seen. He was creating what was once not far from his home in Searsport. What inspired him? By the early 20th century, shipbuilding along the Penobscot Bay was almost non-existent. The busy days when the bay and the river were full of sailing vessels were long past. Residents and former residents remembered those busy days and the people that built and sailed wooden ships. The glory days were within living memory, and those that remembered wanted to make sure these stories were not forgotten. In 1931, Lincoln Colcord wrote an article, Old Shipyards of Searsport, published in the Bangor Daily News. Colcord writes, "The construction of a wooden ship did not require a great deal of equipment, and none of this equipment was of a permanent nature. In 50 years, on an open beach can easily be all that remains of a shipyard where half a dozen square riggers of 1,500 tons were once built for the China trade. Tide and weather have done their work. A new beach has formed where the old one originally lay, and the shipyard has entirely disappeared." He continues the article to begin capturing on paper the exciting history of Searsport shipbuilding. In 1932, George Wasson's book, Sailing Days in the Penobscot, The River and Bay as They Were in the Old Days, was published along with a record of vessels built there contributed by Lincoln Colcord. Wasson started his book saying, it has long been hoped that some more competent person would write concerning the ships and smaller craft of Penobscot Bay, Maine, with some account of the immense shipment of lumber from the Penobscot River. No one has appeared, and meantime, much valuable material is fast becoming forgotten. A few years more and only dry figures will remain to tell that this very vital interest ever existed. While he lamented the authorship of the book, Wasson's colorful descriptions bring to life the busy bay and the river of the 19th century. In 1935, Clifford N. Carver printed a history of his family. It was called The Carver Family of New York, the Carver Family of New England, Robert Carver of Marshfield and his descendants. Carver, too, remembered seeing or hearing the stories of Searsport busy days. He wrote, once Searsport boasted 8 shipyards launching the same type of vessel. There several generations of the Carver family were born, all actively participating in its shipbuilding and maritime pursuits. The old town was then the home of 1/10 of the deep water captains in the American merchant marine, and actually produced more shipmasters than any town of its size in the US. Now the waterfront is silent. The unused wharves have broken up and gradually disappeared, and the last vestiges of the windjammers are gone. Carver's full volume documents many generations of the Carver family and also the shipbuilding and sailing contributions in Penobscot Bay. He even includes an image of the bark John Carver. In 1936, the Penobscot Marine Museum was founded. It was the result of the sentiments of many people, including the authors and families mentioned here, who felt the importance of preserving the historic materials that told the maritime stories of Searsport and Penobscot Bay. The museum started in one building and gradually grew to the 3.5-acre campus we have today. This is a picture of a diorama of Searsport Harbor, focusing on 3 of the shipyards, including the Carver Yard. Thank you for joining us for today's Peek into Paintings. Look for more on shipbuilding and a Peek into Painting program coming soon. And we will end by reflecting on how Waldo Peirce contributed to keeping the memory and history of the heyday of shipbuilding in Searsport, and a look at a model of the bark John Carver, built by Eugene Porter of Searsport. Perhaps Waldo Peirce had visited the museum or read the works I mentioned. His painting is not a snapshot of a moment in time, but was inspired by Searsport's rich shipbuilding history throughout the 19th century, flattening 100 years into oil on canvas. Perhaps he even walked down to this spot, listened to the water lap the shore, and gazed off at the hills in the distance, and his mind's eye saw the waterfront come to life and the men building the John Carver in front of him.